The marble floors held the night's cold like a secret, reflecting the sterile glow of fluorescent lights as Daniel Reyes pushed his cart through the empty corridor, the soft squeak of its wheels echoing farther than it should have in a building that never truly slept. He moved with quiet precision, his posture upright, his motions deliberate, each sweep of the mop exact, each turn of the wrist measured. There was nothing careless about him. Nothing wasted. The faint scent of industrial cleaner lingered in the air, sharp and lemon-sour, mixing with the distant hum of ventilation systems that whispered through the ceiling panels. He paused near the glass wall overlooking the city. Far below, headlights streamed like veins of molten light through the darkened streets. The world moved quickly down there. Faster than anyone inside this tower would ever admit. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn phone. The screen flickered to life, revealing a single saved message. He pressed play. A young girl's voice, soft and slightly distorted by recording, filled the silence. "Good night, Baba. Don't forget to eat something. And don't work too hard, okay?" He listened without moving. The corners of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close. Something private. "Sleep well, Sophia," he murmured under his breath, though she could not hear him. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and resumed his work. No one in the building ever noticed how carefully he worked. No one asked why a man like him carried himself with such quiet discipline, as though he had once been responsible for things far heavier than a mop and a bucket. And no one, not a single person walking those polished halls, could have imagined what Daniel Reyes had done 15 years ago to end up here. Not even him, sometimes. The executive floor was warmer than the rest of the building. Not by much, but enough to feel intentional. The carpets were thicker, absorbing sound. The lighting softer, designed to flatter faces and soften edges. Even the air smelled different, less chemical, more curated. Subtle hints of cedar and something faintly expensive lingered in the space. Daniel adjusted his grip on the mop as he stepped out of the service elevator. It was later than usual for activity up here. Voices carried from the far conference room, low, controlled, but sharp at the edges. The kind of voices that belonged to people who were used to being listened to. He kept his eyes down and moved along the wall, instinctively invisible. Until... "Hey! You!" The voice cut through the air like a clean blade. Daniel stopped. He turned slowly. Standing in the doorway of the conference room was Victor Langford, the man whose name was etched into the building's glass facade 30 stories below. His suit was immaculate, charcoal with a precise cut, his silver cufflinks catching the light. Even at this hour, he looked composed, controlled. Behind him, a dozen executives sat around a long glass table, their expressions ranging from bored to mildly irritated. Victor tilted his head slightly. "You work here, right?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, sir." A faint smile touched Victor's lips, but it carried no warmth. "Perfect timing," he said, stepping aside and gesturing into the room. "We could use a fresh perspective." A few of the executives chuckled softly. Daniel didn't move. "Sir, I don't think—" "Oh, come on," Victor interrupted smoothly. "Don't be shy. We're discussing investment strategies. I'm curious what someone outside our bubble might think." The room shifted. Interest sharpened. Not genuine interest, but anticipation. The kind that came before a spectacle. Daniel understood immediately. This wasn't an invitation. It was a performance. And he was the prop. He stepped inside anyway. The temperature dropped, or maybe it just felt that way. The glass table gleamed under the overhead lights, covered in tablets, financial reports, half-empty glasses of water. Numbers and projections were displayed across a digital board at the far end of the room. Complex models, layered assumptions, risk assessments stacked on risk assessments. Victor leaned casually against the table. "Here's the situation," he said, his tone almost conversational. "We're evaluating a high-yield portfolio, emerging markets, aggressive positioning. High risk, high reward." He glanced at the others, then back at Daniel. "Tell me," he continued. If this were your money, what would you do? A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the room. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to the board. He said nothing. Victor raised an eyebrow. What's wrong? Too complicated? More laughter. Short. Sharp. Daniel exhaled slowly. The smell of cedar and polished wood pressed faintly against his senses. The lights hummed overhead. Somewhere, a pen tapped lightly against glass. He stepped closer to the board. Not hurried. Not hesitant. Just precise. His eyes moved across the projections, quickly, but not carelessly. Patterns aligned. Assumptions revealed themselves in the margins. Risk curves bent where they shouldn't. He spoke quietly. If your hedge depends on volatility staying within that band, he said, pointing, not touching, the lower corner of the model, then your exposure isn't diversified. The room stilled, but only slightly. Victor's smile didn't fade. Go on, he said, amused. Daniel's gaze didn't leave the board. You're stacking correlated risks, he continued. Different markets. Same underlying trigger. A pause. The tapping pen stopped. If one collapses, Daniel added, they all do. Silence stretched. Thin at first. Then heavier. Victor's expression didn't change immediately. But something behind his eyes flickered. Just for a moment. One of the analysts shifted in his seat. Another leaned forward, squinting at the board as if seeing it differently now. Daniel stepped back. That's all, he said. No arrogance. No emphasis. Just fact. The room didn't laugh this time. No one spoke at all. Victor straightened slowly, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly against the edge of the table. For the first time since Daniel had entered the room, he wasn't smiling. And in that fragile, suspended silence, a question began to form, unspoken, but unmistakable. Who exactly had they just invited into the room? Daniel returned to his cart without another word. The corridor felt colder now. Or perhaps it was something else. Behind him, the conference room remained quiet longer than it should have. And somewhere inside that silence, something had shifted. Something small. But irreversible. As Daniel resumed mopping the marble floor, his reflection moved faintly beneath his feet, distorted by water, broken by light. Invisible again. Just the way he preferred it. But far behind him, in a room filled with people who were no longer laughing, Victor Langford was still staring at the board. And for the first time in years, he wasn't certain he was the smartest man in the room. The faint hum of the air conditioning carried through the executive floor the next morning, blending with the muted clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of controlled urgency, as if the building itself had awakened with a question it could not yet answer. Daniel Reyes arrived before sunrise. He always did. The corridors were still dim, lit only by half-powered lights that cast long, pale reflections across the marble floors. His cart rolled forward with its familiar squeak, steady and unremarkable, as if nothing in the world had changed since the night before. But something had. He could feel it. Not in the air itself, but in the absence of something, the casual indifference that usually wrapped around him like a second uniform. It wasn't gone. Just thinner. More fragile. He passed the glass-walled conference room. Inside, the digital board was still active. The same model remained on display. Only now, it was covered in markings. Circles. Recalculations. Notes layered over notes. Someone had not slept. Daniel slowed for a fraction of a second. Just enough to see the lower corner of the projection, the section he had pointed to. Rewritten. Adjusted. Questioned. He moved on without stopping. By mid-morning, the building had returned to its usual rhythm, controlled chaos beneath polished calm. Executives moved with purpose, assistants carried tablets and schedules, and conversation stayed just below the level of confrontation. But beneath it all, tension threaded quietly. It began in whispers. Did you look at the volatility cluster again? I reran it twice, he might be right. That's not possible. Then explain the correlation spike. The words traveled carefully, never too loud, never too direct. But they traveled. Inside a smaller strategy room, 3 senior analysts stood around a screen, their jackets draped over chairs, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest discomfort. One of them, a man named Carter, leaned forward, tapping the screen. "Look at this," he said. "If the commodity index shifts even 2% outside the band, it triggers all 3 positions." Another finished quietly. Carter nodded. "Exactly." A pause. Then, more softly, "That janitor, what exactly did he see?" No one answered. Because none of them had an answer they were comfortable saying out loud. Victor Langford stood alone in his office, 40 floors above the street, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass behind him. The sunlight was sharp, cutting clean lines across the room, illuminating everything except his expression. He held a tablet in his hand. Daniel's words replayed in his mind, not the tone, not the delivery. Just the precision. "You're stacking correlated risks." Simple. Too simple. Victor tapped the screen, pulling up the revised models. He had built empires on recognizing patterns others missed. And now, there it was. Buried beneath layers of complexity, hidden in plain sight. A flaw. Small enough to ignore. Large enough to destroy everything if left unchecked. His jaw tightened slightly. He didn't like surprises. He liked control. And last night, for a brief, unacceptable moment, he had lost it. Victor set the tablet down. "Find him," he said, his voice calm. An assistant near the door nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." "And pull everything we have on him," Victor added. "Employment records. Background checks. I want to know exactly who he is." A pause. Then, more quietly, "And how he saw that." Daniel was in the east corridor when it happened. The smell of cleaning solution lingered faintly as he wiped down a series of glass panels, his movements steady, almost meditative. A group of executives passed behind him. They didn't stop. But they looked. Not directly. Not openly. But enough. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. He just never reacted. He finished the panel, stepped back, and adjusted the cloth in his hand. Then he saw it. Through the glass wall ahead. Another conference room. Empty. Except for the board. Numbers filled the surface, dense, layered, complex. Someone had left mid-calculation, equations unfinished, assumptions half-built. Daniel stood still. Just for a moment. The silence inside the room felt different. He stepped in. The air was cooler. The faint scent of dry erase marker lingered, sharp and almost metallic. He approached the board. His eyes moved quickly, not reading, but understanding. A projection error. Subtle. Easy to miss. But it shifted everything downstream. He picked up a marker. Hesitated. Then, with the same quiet precision as before, he made 3 small changes. A number adjusted. A variable corrected. A line redrawn. That was all. He placed the marker back exactly where it had been. And turned to leave. "Stop." The voice came from the doorway. Daniel didn't flinch. He turned slowly. Victor Langford stood there. Watching. Behind him, 2 analysts lingered, their expressions tense, uncertain. Victor stepped into the room, his gaze shifting from Daniel to the board. He said nothing at first. He simply looked. Then he walked closer. The sound of his shoes against the polished floor was sharp, deliberate. He stopped in front of the board. Studied it. His eyes narrowed slightly. A long moment passed. Then another. The room held its breath. And then, silence. Not the casual kind. Not the empty kind. This silence had weight. Victor reached out, tracing one of the corrected lines, not touching the board, just following it through the air. He exhaled slowly. "Explain that," he said. Daniel met his gaze. "It was misaligned," he said simply. Victor's eyes flicked to him. That's not an explanation. Daniel nodded once. The growth rate assumption doesn't match the baseline, he said. It skews the projection. A pause. You correct it, Daniel added. The risk becomes visible. The analysts exchanged a glance. Victor didn't move. For the first time, there was no performance in his posture. No amusement. No superiority. Just calculation. Careful. Focused. Dangerous. You've done this before, Victor said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The faint hum of the ventilation system filled the space between them. Finally, he said, A long time ago. Victor studied him. Not as a curiosity now. Not as a joke. But as a problem. A variable he hadn't accounted for. And variables, Victor knew, could destroy entire systems if left unchecked. The silence returned. Heavier this time. More deliberate. Then Victor stepped back. Get back to your work, he said. Calm. Controlled. But different. Daniel inclined his head slightly. No defiance. No submission. Just acknowledgement. He left the room without another word. The door closed softly behind him. Inside, the analysts remained frozen. Victor continued staring at the board. At the corrections. At the implications. He fixed it in seconds, one of them said quietly. Victor didn't respond. Because the question forming in his mind wasn't about speed. It was about identity. About history. About something that didn't belong in this building in a janitor's uniform. He finally spoke. Run a full audit on every model tied to this structure, he said. And him? The other analyst asked. Victor's gaze hardened slightly. Yes, he said. Especially him. Daniel returned to the corridor. The familiar squeak of the cart grounded him. The smell of cleaner. The cold marble. The quiet. Everything exactly as it had been. And yet, not at all the same. He reached into his pocket again. Press play. Good night, Baba. He closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. A small moment. A private one. Then he opened them. And kept walking. But somewhere above him, behind glass and steel and layers of power, people were no longer asking what he did. They were asking who he was. And more importantly, what would happen when they found out? The rain came down in thin, slanted lines against the building's glass facade, tapping softly like restrained fingers. As Daniel Reyes stood beneath the service entrance awning, the damp air clinging to his uniform and carrying the metallic scent of a storm that hadn't fully decided to break. He had just stepped outside for his short break. The city felt different in the rain, muted, reflective, less certain of itself. Headlights smeared across wet pavement, and distant traffic softened into a low, continuous hush. Daniel rested one hand lightly against the handle of his cart, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street. He didn't look like a man being watched. But he was. Across the street, behind tinted glass, a black sedan idled quietly. Inside, a man in a dark coat lowered a pair of binoculars. He's here, he said into a phone. Right where you said. A pause. Then, a simple reply through the speaker. Good, came Victor Langford's voice. Don't lose him. Inside the building, the investigation had already begun. Files were opened. Records pulled. Databases searched. But Daniel Reyes did not exist in the way they expected. His employment file was thin, almost suspiciously so. Basic identification. A hiring date. No higher education listed. No prior corporate experience. Nothing remarkable. Nothing threatening. And yet, the deeper they dug, the more the silence around his past began to feel constructed. Try older records, Victor instructed, standing behind his assistant's desk, his voice low but edged with impatience. 15, maybe 20 years back. That far? The assistant asked. Victor didn't blink. He didn't learn that from cleaning floors. Daniel returned inside just as the rain began to fall harder. Water beaded along his sleeves as he stepped back into the sterile brightness of the corridor. He paused briefly on the mat, wiping his shoes with quiet care, as though small rituals still mattered. They always had. Because when everything else had been taken from him, precision was the one thing he had left. He resumed his work. But this time, the building didn't ignore him. 2 security guards stood near the elevator. They stopped talking when he approached. One of them watched him a second too long. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. But he said nothing. He didn't need to. The file came through just after noon. Victor sat alone when he opened it. The office was silent except for the soft ticking of a minimalist clock on the wall and the distant hum of the city beyond the glass. He scrolled slowly. And then he stopped. A name. Daniel Reyes? But not a janitor. Not back then. A photograph appeared on the screen, clean-cut, composed, eyes sharp with focus. Younger, but unmistakably the same man. Below it a title. Senior Quantitative Analyst. Victor leaned back slightly. Interest sharpened. He read further. Academic distinctions. Mathematical modeling awards. Early career acceleration that bordered on unprecedented. And then, the shift. A redacted section. Followed by a headline. Internal investigation, financial irregularities. Victor's eyes narrowed. He continued. Allegations. Data leaks. Unauthorized disclosures. Then the final note. Subject discredited. Career terminated. Industry blacklisted. Victor exhaled slowly. So, he murmured. Not impressed. Not sympathetic. Just understanding. You fell, he said quietly to the empty room. His gaze returned to the photograph. But people like you don't disappear without a reason. The truth was heavier than any file could capture. And it had never really left Daniel. It lived in the quiet spaces between his thoughts. In the pauses he never explained. In the discipline he never abandoned. 15 years earlier, Daniel had stood in a different room. Not as a janitor, but as the smartest analyst most people had ever met. He had seen something others ignored. Patterns that didn't align. Trades that moved too perfectly. Profits that arrived too cleanly. He had reported it. Because he believed in systems. In integrity. In the idea that truth, once revealed, would correct itself. He had been wrong. The firm turned on him within weeks. Evidence disappeared. Narratives shifted. He became the problem. The accusation. The liability. And when it was over, he had nothing left. No career. No reputation. Just a wife who believed him. And a daughter who didn't yet understand. Then came the night everything broke. A hospital corridor. The sharp smell of antiseptic. The cold grip of loss that settled into his chest and never fully left. After that, he stopped trying to be seen. Mr. Reyes? The voice snapped him back to the present. Daniel turned. 2 security officers stood behind him now. Closer than before. We need you to come with us, one of them said. The tone was polite. But final. Daniel glanced briefly at the hallway. At the polished floors. At the reflection staring back at him. Then he nodded. Of course. The room they brought him to was small. Windowless. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. A metal table. 2 chairs. A single overhead light that cast sharp shadows across the walls. Daniel sat down without being asked. He placed his hands on the table. Still. Controlled. The door opened again. Victor Langford stepped inside. Alone this time. He closed the door behind him. The click echoed louder than it should have. Victor didn't sit immediately. He studied Daniel for a moment. Longer than necessary. You should have stayed invisible, he said finally. Daniel met his gaze. I tried, he replied. Victor smiled faintly. But you couldn't help yourself. A pause. You saw something you weren't supposed to see, Victor continued. Again. Daniel said nothing. Victor placed a folder on the table. Opened it. Turned it so Daniel could see. His old file. His past. Laid out like evidence. You had a promising career, Victor said. Until you decided to, what? Play hero? Daniel's expression didn't change. I told the truth, he said. Victor's smile faded. That's what they all say. He leaned forward slightly. Here's the problem, Victor continued, his voice soft but edged with steel. You don't get to walk into my company, point out flaws in my systems, and pretend it means nothing. A beat. You don't get to exist quietly after that. Daniel absorbed the words. Felt their weight. But not their threat. What do you want? He asked. Victor straightened. Simple, he said. You're going to take responsibility. For what? Victor's eyes held his. For accessing confidential data, he said smoothly. For interfering with proprietary models. For corporate espionage. The words landed cleanly. Precisely. Constructed. Daniel understood immediately. This wasn't reaction. It was strategy. Victor continued. You'll sign a statement, he said. Admit you manipulated internal projections. We handle it quietly. You disappear again. A pause. Refuse, Victor added. And it becomes something much louder. Daniel looked down at the file. Then back at Victor. You're using my work, he said. Not a question. Victor didn't deny it. You handed it to me, he replied. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Deliberate. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. For the first time. He looked tired. Not weak. Just tired. I've been here before, he said quietly. Victor tilted his head. And you didn't learn? Daniel's gaze sharpened. I learned exactly what this costs. A beat. Then. I just won't lie to protect it. Victor studied him. Then nodded once. As if confirming something. Then we're done here. He turned toward the door. Opened it. The guard stepped back into view. Take him, Victor said. The corridor outside felt colder than before. People watched this time. Not openly. But enough. Daniel walked between the guards, his steps steady, his expression unchanged. But inside. The weight returned. Not new. Just familiar. And heavier now. Because this time. It wasn't just his life at risk. It was everything he had left. His daughter. His quiet. His fragile, hard-earned peace. As the elevator doors closed in front of him, Daniel caught one last reflection of himself in the steel surface. Distorted. Fragmented. But still standing. And somewhere deep beneath the surface. Unbroken. But far above, in a room filled with power and glass and carefully controlled narratives. Victor Langford had already begun writing the version of the story the world would believe. And Daniel Reyes was about to lose everything. Again. The holding room smelled faintly of stale air and overused disinfectant, the kind that clung to metal surfaces and never quite faded, as Daniel Reyes sat alone beneath a dim overhead light that flickered just enough to make time feel uneven. There were no windows. No clocks. Only the quiet hum of electricity and the distant echo of footsteps beyond the walls. He sat still, his hands resting loosely on the table, his breathing steady. They had taken his phone. Which meant no message. No voice saying, "Good night, Baba." For the first time in years, the silence felt heavier than he could ignore. But he did not break. He had learned long ago that panic was a luxury for people who believed someone was coming to help them. Daniel had never relied on that belief. Hours passed. Or maybe less. Time had a way of dissolving in rooms like this. The door opened without warning. A man stepped in, mid-50s, slightly disheveled, his tie loosened as if it had been pulled at too many times in frustration rather than fatigue. Daniel looked up. Recognition came slowly. Then fully. "Armin," Daniel said. The man exhaled, almost like a laugh that didn't quite form. "It's been a long time," he replied. Armin Siddiqui. 15 years earlier, he had been one of the few who stood close enough to the truth to see it forming. And one of the many who stepped back when it became dangerous. He closed the door behind him. The soft click settled into the room like a decision. "I wasn't sure you'd recognize me," Armin said. "I remember the ones who stayed quiet," Daniel replied calmly. The words weren't bitter. Just precise. Armin accepted them. He nodded once. "You were right back then," he said. A pause. "I know that now." Daniel said nothing. Because he had not spent the last 15 years waiting to hear that. Armin stepped forward, placing a thin folder on the table. "You're being set up," he continued. "But I think you already figured that out." Daniel glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "Victor Langford," he said. Armin's jaw tightened. "He's not just protecting his firm," Armin said. "He's running the same structure you exposed years ago, just bigger. Cleaner. Harder to trace." Daniel's gaze lifted slightly. Not surprised. Just confirmed. "The model you corrected?" Armin added. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a mask." A silence followed. Thicker than before. "He's been hiding systemic risk behind layered projections," Armin continued. "If it collapses, it doesn't just hurt investors, it destabilizes entire sectors." Daniel leaned back slightly. "And now he needs a scapegoat," he said. Armin nodded. "And you're perfect for it." A beat. History repeats cleanly when people believe the first version. The folder slid across the table. Daniel opened it. Inside. Documents. Transaction trails. Internal communications. Hidden accounts. The architecture of deception. Carefully built. Carefully hidden. But not invisible. Not to someone who knew where to look. Daniel's eyes moved across the pages. Slowly. Precisely. "You kept this?" he asked. Armin shook his head. "I found it," he said. "After last night." A pause. "When you spoke, something didn't sit right. So I started digging." Daniel closed the folder. "And now?" Armin met his gaze. "Now I'm finishing what I should have done 15 years ago." The door opened again. This time. With force. Victor Langford entered, flanked by 2 legal advisors, their expressions composed, their posture already aligned with the outcome they expected. He stopped when he saw Armin. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "This is a restricted." "Save it," Armin interrupted. The room shifted. Victor's gaze sharpened. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Neither should he," Armin replied, nodding toward Daniel. "But here we are." A pause. Then Victor smiled. Thin. Controlled. "You've always had poor judgment," he said. "Maybe," Armin replied. "But not today." He picked up the folder. Held it slightly higher. "This goes public," he said. "And your entire structure collapses." Silence. Heavy. Immediate. Victor didn't move. But something in the room changed. Not the temperature. Not the light. Something deeper. Control. Slipping. Just slightly. "You're bluffing," Victor said. Armin shook his head. "No," he said. "I'm correcting a mistake." He turned toward the door. "Boardroom," he added. 10 minutes. Then he left. Just like that. The boardroom felt colder than it had the first night. Not in temperature. But in expectation. Executives filled the seats again. The same table. The same glass. But no laughter this time. No performance. Only tension. Daniel was brought in last. Not as a janitor. Not as a guest. But as something undefined. Victor stood at the head of the table. Composed. Controlled. until Armin entered and placed the folder down in front of everyone. "This," he said, "is the truth." The room stilled. Page by page, the evidence unfolded. Transaction records linked. Shell accounts exposed. Risk models intentionally distorted. Every piece fitting together. Not theory. Not suspicion. Proof. The silence returned. But this time, it was absolute. No shifting. No whispering. Just the weight of realization settling across every face in the room. Victor didn't speak. Not at first. Because for the first time, there was nothing he could control. Daniel stood quietly at the far end of the table. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just present. Armin stepped back. "It was all hidden behind complexity," he said. "Until someone saw it clearly." A pause. Then he looked at Daniel. "And said it out loud?" Victor finally moved. A step forward. Then another. His composure cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. "You think this changes anything?" he said, his voice lower now. Tighter. Daniel met his gaze. "It already has," he replied. A beat. Then, the doors opened. Authorities entered. Calm. Efficient. Final. Victor didn't resist. Not physically. But his silence said enough. Later, the building felt quieter than it ever had before. Not empty. But changed. As if something heavy had been removed. Daniel stood once more in the corridor. The same marble floors. The same lights. The same faint scent of cleaning solution. But this time, he wasn't invisible. People looked. Not with curiosity, but with something else. Respect. He reached into his pocket. His phone had been returned. He pressed play. "Good night, Baba." He closed his eyes briefly. The tension eased. Just a little. But even as the truth settled and the system corrected itself, one question still lingered in the quiet corners of the building. Not about Victor. Not about the fraud. But about the man who had seen it all. And said nothing until he had to. Who was Daniel Reyes? Really? The morning light spilled softly through the thin curtains of a modest apartment, diffused and gentle, carrying with it the faint warmth of a day that had not yet decided what it would become. As Daniel Reyes stood in the small kitchen, the quiet hum of a kettle rising steadily behind him. The space was simple. Clean. Lived in. A wooden table with faint scratches along its surface. A pair of mismatched chairs. A school bag resting near the door, slightly worn at the edges. The air carried the subtle scent of tea leaves and toasted bread, ordinary, grounding, real. Daniel poured hot water into a chipped ceramic mug. His movements were the same as always. Measured. Deliberate. But something had shifted. Not in how he moved, but in the weight he no longer carried. Footsteps padded softly across the floor. "Baba?" He turned. Sophia stood in the doorway, her hair slightly tangled from sleep, her eyes still adjusting to the light. She held on to the frame for a moment, as if anchoring herself between dreams and morning. "You're home," she said. Not surprised. Just relieved. Daniel nodded once. "I'm home." She stepped forward quickly, wrapping her arms around him without hesitation. He placed a hand gently on her back. Closed his eyes. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to something small and complete. Something that had nearly been taken from him. "You didn't answer my message last night," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "I'm sorry." She pulled back slightly, studying his face. "Did something happen?" Daniel considered the question. The truth, in its entirety, did not belong to her. Not yet. But the feeling behind it. That she deserved. "Yes," he said softly. "But it's over now." She nodded, accepting that in the way only children can, without needing every detail, only the certainty behind the words. "Okay," she said. And just like that. It was enough. The city moved as it always did. Traffic surged. People hurried. Markets opened. Conversations overlapped into a constant rhythm of urgency and intention. But inside the financial district, something had changed. News traveled quickly. Faster than official statements. Faster than damage control. Victor Langford's arrest had not been quiet. It couldn't be. Too many eyes. Too many witnesses. Too much evidence. The board had acted swiftly. Public statements, internal restructuring, promises of transparency delivered in carefully measured tones. But beneath all of it, there was a deeper shift. A recalibration. Because systems built on illusion could not survive exposure. Daniel walked into the building one last time. Not in uniform. Not pushing a cart. But in the same quiet manner he always had. The marble floors reflected him clearly now. No distortion. No fragmentation. Just a man walking forward. People noticed. Of course they did. But the looks were different now. Less dismissive. More uncertain. As if they were still adjusting to the idea that the person they had overlooked had never been small. He reached the executive floor. The air felt the same. Controlled. Polished. Intentional. But the tension that once lived there was gone. Or perhaps redirected. The boardroom doors were open. Inside, several members of the interim leadership team stood waiting. Armin was among them. He gave a small nod as Daniel entered. No ceremony. No applause. Just acknowledgement. Mr. Reyes? One of the board members began, straightening slightly. We'd like to formally apologize for. Daniel raised a hand gently. You don't need to, he said. The man paused. Caught off guard. Daniel stepped further into the room. His gaze moved across the table. The same table where he had once stood as a joke. Then as an accusation. Now, something else entirely. We were wrong, another board member said more quietly. Daniel nodded once. Yes, he said. No edge. No bitterness. Just truth. A silence settled briefly. Then Armin stepped forward. We've reviewed everything, he said. Your work. Your past. What happened to you? A pause. And what you prevented here. Daniel didn't respond. Because acknowledgement had never been the goal. Armin continued. There's a position, he said. Senior advisory. Full autonomy. Resources. Authority. The room held its breath. This company could use someone who sees what others miss, he added. Daniel looked at him. Then at the table. Then briefly. At his own reflection in the glass. 15 years earlier, this would have been everything. Recognition. Restoration. A return to the world that had cast him out. But that world had taken more than it had ever given. He exhaled slowly. I appreciate the offer, he said. A pause. Then. But I'm not coming back. The words landed softly. But with finality. The board members exchanged glances. Confusion. Surprise. A hint of disbelief. You've earned this, one of them said. Daniel nodded. I know, he replied. And that was the difference. He didn't need them to prove it anymore. Armin studied him carefully. Then what will you do? He asked. Daniel allowed himself the smallest shift in expression. Not quite a smile. But something close. I'll work, he said. A beat. Just not here. The sun was lower by the time Daniel left the building. The light had softened, casting long shadows across the pavement, turning glass into gold and steel into something warmer than it had any right to be. He didn't look back. There was nothing left there for him. Not anymore. That evening, the apartment felt warmer. Sophia sat at the table, working through her school assignments, her tongue slightly pressed against her cheek in concentration. Daniel sat across from her, reviewing a small stack of papers, not financial models, not corporate reports. Applications. Local work. Steady work. Honest work. Baba? She said suddenly, looking up. My teacher asked what you do. Daniel paused. A simple question. Once, it would have carried weight. Expectation. Explanation. Now, it didn't need to. What did you tell her? He asked. Sophia smiled slightly. I said you fix things? Daniel considered that. Then nodded. That sounds right. She returned to her work. Satisfied. And Daniel sat quietly in the soft light of a life he had chosen. Not the one that had been taken. Not the one that had been offered back. But the one that remained. And in that quiet, steady moment, there was no audience. No recognition. No need to be seen. Because the truth no longer required witnesses. Only presence. Only integrity. Only the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly who he was. Even when the world did not.